Good evening. My name is Tony. I'm the lead pastor at Gateway here. What a great week we've had. I was pegged to bring the end, and I'm glad that I am bringing up the end, sort of, but the speakers were so good. So we're going to give it a shot, all right? So we were talking, I went to Brett and our team teach, and I said, well, what should I teach on? I mean, we've pretty much covered the whole Sermon on the Mount. We got the guest speakers picking a beatitude and doing that. And the whole series, when we started planning the series, one verse really sort of just stood out to me. And I wanted to look at that section of Scripture and go after a verse. Now, I have to confess, I find it difficult sometimes, and this is a confession. I know you're going to be like, what? You're a pastor? I really find it difficult sometimes to live up to certain commands in Scripture, except this one. Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Come on now, right? I am perfectamundo here. Wife, be quiet. Nobody asked you. But yeah, I mean, I read something like this and I'm like, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, can't do that, right? Out of here, giving up on this thing already. So most of you know, and some of you don't, but most of you know my upbringing, my background. I was raised in a pretty strict religious environment. Now, when I say strict, what I mean by strict is that all of my behaviors were sort of held up to Jesus, even as a child. I remember it wasn't too long ago, it was a few years ago, we were sitting in a group of guys and we were talking about, we were praying. We actually got together to pray, and one young guy there who had a young son started sharing. I didn't know his son or him that well. And he started sharing about, he was like physically and emotionally, spiritually distressed, like wanted us to pray for his son. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, he's gone off the deep end and, he's probably out there living riotous. I'm thinking prodigal son, right? And he said, the comment, I just want you to pray that his behavior would line up more with, be more like Jesus. And we got talking, and come to find out, the boy was 4 years old. But I grew up in an environment like that. It's like we were so afraid that our children were going to grow up and be like little hellions and demons, and you know what I'm saying? Scripture was used to scare us and manipulate us and get us into where we needed to be so that we behaved. So that we were good boys and girls. Because good boys and girls grow up to be good men and women. So you think. Now, I don't blame my parents. I really don't. My mom and dad are in the church, and they're not here tonight, but they're listening online. Hi, Mom and Dad. I can only hear my father right now. But we've had conversations about this, and we've talked about what it was like growing up, and we've come to grips with the fact that there was a lot that they got wrong, but they didn't know any better. It was the environment and the culture that we grew up in. It was what they were saved into. They were saved into a religious tradition that has its roots in the Puritan movement. Now think about that. Puritan, the word itself. If you don't know history, in the 16th and 17th century, the Puritans came over here to establish a religious commonwealth, right? Where all of society and everybody would just behave and fall in line and be good. be perfect. They came to establish a holy commonwealth where people would carry out God's will on earth, and all of the civil authorities and all of the enforcing religious laws would go into effect, and people just had to get in line. So in 1692, they had the witch trials. You say, well, were the Puritans behind that? We don't know for sure, but most historians will tell you that it was the Puritan laws and religion and leaders and clergy who, if they didn't burn people at the stake, they sure threw the gasoline on the fire. In 1692, there were over 200 people accused of witchcraft in the colonial Massachusetts. 20 of them were executed. 5 were men, 14 were women, and 2 dogs. My religious tribe has its history in what we call the American Holiness Movement, which came up out of that Puritan idea, that Puritan strict religious life. They took serious this call to be perfect as your Father is perfect. They took serious this call to be holy as your Father in heaven, God, is holy. The only problem is, and the unfortunate thing is that as in most religious circles, we take holiness to be some sort of outward act of purity. Women had to wear certain clothes. They couldn't wear jewelry. My father will tell you growing up that he didn't wear his wedding band because some people in the church thought that it was just too worldly. Men had outward requirements as well. Like the Pharisees of old, somehow we couldn't see how we had become the Pharisees themselves by simply becoming an outward, holiness, pure people. The problem is, an outward purity cannot replace what the biblical holiness means in a person's life. So growing up in this, naturally, I struggled with it. I wrestled with it. Being right with God was more about my performance than anything else. It was based on that. You know, the old saying, don't smoke, don't drink, don't chew, and don't date girls who do, right? I heard that said before growing up. My wife chews all the time. I'll be honest with you, by the time I got to college, I knew a lot about being good, but I didn't know a lot about being holy. I knew very little about what Jesus really meant to be perfect. And the result was this: I was exhausted. As you have been too. If anyone has tried to be good enough, if anyone has tried to live that outward, holy, pure life, it's exhausting. It's a lot of work to look this good, right? I struggled with a sense of guilt and failure every day of my life. I lived in fear that if somehow I did some sin, that somehow God would turn his back and disown me. Like the Puritans of old, they actually believed that if God was going to punish you for your sin in the afterlife, we have the right to punish you in this life. And I beat myself up and I felt guilty and a failure. Trying to be good all the time. Because if you aren't, God might not love you. I felt shame. You know the difference between guilt and shame, right? Guilt is that you actually did something wrong. Oh, I was guilty. I know I had done things wrong. But because of the ritualistic and the strict religion, it became shame to me. Shame is not, I did something wrong. Shame says, and you begin to believe this, that there's something wrong with you. That's shame. Guilt you can take care of, right? Just confess it, get over it, move on. But shame, how do you get over this constant message in your head that there's something wrong with you? Something else happened. In college, I got better at being good. And then I got prideful. My life took on this pride and this judgmentalism and this lack of mercy and grace for people who didn't act and look and behave like I did. What's wrong with you? I've got this. I can do this. Why can't you do this? I have learned in my life that you cannot be righteous like Jesus talks about being righteous in the Sermon on the Mount by simply checking off the do's and the don'ts. Because I have met people, myself included, who can get really good at being good out here and be very far from what God means by righteousness in the heart. The more, and this is truth for me, the more that I strived for outward purity, the less my heart actually looked like Jesus. It sounds strange, doesn't it? You're like, well, I thought we're supposed to try. Really? I thought Jesus said that a person would be on the outside what comes from the inside. So something else needs to change besides just my behavior. And this is why Jesus says what he says at the end of this section of the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus says, I am calling you to a greater righteousness. There were entire groups of people in Jesus' day who were there listening to his message, listening to his sermon, who had disciplined their lives to keep God's laws and commandments. There were people there who gave their entire life to being pure on the outside. Outwardly, they were religious pure, but Jesus would look at them, and in the Gospels, he would say things like this to them. You are like whitewashed tombs. You know what that is? On the outside, you look very good, but on the inside, you are dead and just a pile of bones. And Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount, and he calls his followers to something different than that of the Pharisees. Different than even some of the things I grew up with and some of you grew up with in the church. Jesus calls us to something greater. And in Matthew chapter 5, this is the section after Jesus gives the Beatitudes what we call a greater righteousness. And in that, he says this in verse 20. He says, but I warn you, as he starts to go into this section on a greater righteousness, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the law, religious law, and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to stop and ask yourself, what was the Pharisees' righteousness? Well, they were really good at keeping rules and laws, but missing the wisdom and the heart of the law. The law was intended to remind us that our hearts must need to change, not just our outward appearance and behavior. So we have to understand the context of our verse. The key to our verse today is this verse. Because Jesus starts this section off with this better righteousness. And then he begins to give, this is about when everyone's jaw dropped. I'm just being honest. Everyone's jaw dropped because everyone that was listening to Jesus looked to the Pharisees as perfect. If you wanted to be like anybody religiously, it was the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They looked to them and they said, these people are like blessed by God. They are good. They keep every law. They don't break any law. I mean, they even get angry when you break the laws. Everyone's jaw dropped. They considered the Pharisees and the teachers of the law to be pure and holy and good. But Jesus calls his disciples to demonstrate a righteousness that surpasses their righteousness. And then he gives these 6 examples. He goes, okay, let me give you these antitheses, these examples of what I'm talking about. Jesus gives these examples. The first one is about murder. He says, and he starts these examples as, you've heard it said in the Old Testament, in the law, you've heard it said that thou shalt not commit murder. Yep. Everybody's like, I have never murdered anybody in my life. I am good. Never killed anybody. And then Jesus says, but I tell you, if you hate a brother or sister and you say, Raka, which means you idiot, you fool, you might as well just commit murder because in God's eyes it's the same thing. What? And he gives these examples. He gives an example about adultery. You've heard it said in the Old Testament that thou shalt not commit adultery. Yep, never committed adultery. I have been faithful to my wife. Well, I tell you that if you've ever looked at a woman with lust in your heart, that you have already committed adultery with her. At that point, everybody probably just wanted to put their head down and walk away. Jesus is making a point here. And he gives 4 more examples, and then he gets